morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was hoping that my Minister, Ed Davey, Minister of State of the Digital Economy, was going to be here this morning to give this address. You'll have quickly realised that I am not he. But the good news is that I know exactly what he was going to say, partly due to my close working relationship with the Minister, but also because I helped write his speech. So you'll know exactly what the Minister was going to say. And for those of you in the room for this morning's keynote speech by Kieran Martin, I hope my remarks will flow very well on from his remarks, although unfortunately I won't be covering Monsters, Inc., the Pixar film, or the fall of ancient Rome, but I will endeavour to entertain you in so much as I can as we talk about the launch of this year's Information Security Breaches Survey. In a moment, I'll be handing over to my PwC colleagues, or colleagues from PwC, to talk about the results in detail. But before then, I'd like to take the opportunity to say a few remarks myself. So as Kieran Martin, the DG of GCHQ, made clear this morning, and as I want to reiterate, government is absolutely determined to make the UK one of the safest places in the world to do business online. That determination is borne out by the fact that in a climate of shrinking public sector resources, government has put aside 860 million over the 2011 to 2016 period to try and reduce the risks and indeed maximise the opportunities that the UK can gain from the cybersecurity agenda. And as part of that government-wide programme, we are committed to working with industry to share information about the risks that we individually and collectively face to help us all understand the policy choices that we have to make. And the annual Information Security Breaches Survey is a key part of that overall evidence base. It's already proven to be hugely valuable in informing us all collectively about the issues that we're facing and the trends that we're seeing and the implications and the costs that cybersecurity can have for all organisations. So, on to the 2015 version of the survey. As I say, Chris, Andrew and Richard will be talking you through the results in more detail, but I wanted to talk about some of the headlines briefly. It probably won't surprise you to hear that the scale and costs of attacks have risen. 90% of large organisations and 73% of small organisations suffered a breach, and that's up from 81% and 60% in 2014, respectively. And the average cost of the worst breaches for big businesses now stands at nearly 1.5 million, and that's up from 600,000 in 2014. And for small and medium-sized firms, the average cost of the worst breach can now reach over 300,000, and that's up from 115,000 last year. So this is a worrying picture on the face of it, although I guess it's we should also take account of the fact that some of these figures, some of these trends could be a result of greater awareness in organisations that they're now better at spotting breaches and indeed calculating the impacts of them. And there's also some positive news in the survey results as well in terms of the awareness raising and the positive action that companies are taking as a result of the cyber threats. So more businesses are using government's 10 steps of cybersecurity. That's up from a quarter last year, now stands at a third, and nearly half of all organisations, 49%, have already got the Cyber Essentials accreditation or plan to do so in the next year, which is fantastic news and something I'll be returning to in a moment. The survey contains many other interesting factors, and the human dimension appears to be an increasing factor in breaches. 3/4 of large organisations suffered a staff-related breach. That's up from 58% a year ago, and nearly 1 in 3 small organisations did the same, and that's up from 22% from the previous year. But again, there's positive news here as well, with signs that industry are starting to respond to this more positively, with more and more organisations, large and small, providing ongoing security awareness training to their employees. And again, according to the survey, those organisations which have security policy in place that their employees understand experience 1/3 fewer breaches than those that don't. That's pretty self-evident statistic, but indeed a call to arms for those organisations who don't have a well-understood security policy in place to hurry up and get one. And again, indeed, last October, government launched a free online training program for small businesses. So I encourage small organisations out there to go and look at that if they are still in need of support. And elsewhere, it's pleasing to see that the survey seems to suggest that organisations are starting to get a better grip of dealing with the risks that come with the bring your own devices approach. And indeed, there's more government guidance on this as well, published recently, that can support organisations manage that particular risk further. So, as I say, PwC will delve into detail in a moment, but I think it's fair to say that it's a pretty mixed picture, as you probably one would suspect. And whilst it's disappointing to see that the scale and costs of breaches have increased, there are also lots of positive conclusions to draw to as well. I want to end by talking about some of the wider government initiatives and schemes that are picked up in the survey, if I can. And I think it's fair to say that we, and by we I mean the UK, have made considerable progress over the last 4 or 5 years on this agenda. And partly that's been working very much in partnership to put in place the guidance, support, the schemes and so on to help us all manage the threat. The 10 steps guide that I've already referenced and Kieran Martin referenced this morning is a key part of that landscape. It was updated at the turn of the year when the Prime Minister went to speak to Obama, with cybersecurity being high up the agenda. And we've also updated our small business version of that guidance. It's available on our stand in Infosec. And indeed, excuse me, and indeed on gov.uk. Excuse me. I also want to talk very briefly, and I will not be able to do it justice in one paragraph, about the skills agenda, but the skills challenge, which remains an acute one in the UK and globally, is something which, again, we're starting to see mature. If I just point to one recent initiative, it would be our launch last year of the Cyber Mooc, the massive open online course that government launched in collaboration with Open University. And it's fantastic how well that scheme has been, that 8-week free course has been embraced by the community, up to 55,000 registrations and counting of our Cyber Mooc. So if you're not aware, please check it out. We're getting great feedback. And again, I said I'd return to Cyber Essentials scheme that I mentioned earlier. For those not aware, it's a scheme we launched last year. It covers the 5 basic technical controls that all organisations, large and small, should have in place to manage some of the common, most key and prevalent internet-based threats. The adoption of the scheme is growing. We're already seeing many hundreds of organisations obtain the accreditation and the badge that comes with it, including many in the FTSE 100, Vodafone, Barclays, National Grid, GlaxoSmithKline, to name a few, and many, many, many more on the way. I really believe in the power that Cyber Essentials can give organisations and the assurance it can give them. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a key step in making sure the essentials are in place. GCHQ really believe in the power that Cyber Essentials can give a firm. And it's really encouraging that many more outside of government are starting to see the value in Cyber Essentials. SC Magazine are holding their annual awards ceremony this evening, and I'm absolutely delighted to say that Cyber Essentials is going to be recognised at that awards by receiving their prestigious Editor's Choice Award for outstanding contribution to cyber security. So it's a great testament to the hard work both within government and the standards community and the industry community in developing that scheme, and thank you for all of you involved in that. Finally, I want to say a few words about the UK's cyber security sector itself. Worth over 6 billion, employs over 40,000 people and growing. We're extremely fortunate to have such a strong, innovative and successful cybersecurity sector to rely on. And this vibrancy is very much on show over the next 3 days, both within this whole event, but also in the new government-supported UK Cyber Innovation Zone. Please visit the 11 companies who won a starring place in the zone on level 1 here today. And on Thursday, 4 finalists, GeoLang, Pervade Software, Pure Li-Fi and ZoneFox will be battling it out for the title of the UK's most innovative small cybersecurity company year. Thank you very much to Atkins and HP for supporting the competition, and I wish all 4 finalists, if you're in the room, very, very good luck in winning that competition. But all the companies in the UK cyber sector, large and small, have a huge, huge opportunity to derive from the increase in domestic demand that we all hope to see come about for cybersecurity products and services, but equally from the already vast and growing export market for cybersecurity products and services. UK cybersecurity exports grew 22% last year, and through the work of the Cyber Growth Partnership, we are committed in government supporting the sector grow even faster still. So just to wrap up then, the UK, I think, has come a long way over the last few years, both in terms of public sector and private sector, and a lot of that has been borne out through the great partnership work that we've seen over those years. Of course, there's still a lot more that we need to do collectively and individually, but working together, government and industry, we can continue to get us there. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Andrew, I think, to take us through the results in more detail. Thank you.
Okay, so just before we get into the actual headlines, the important stories, and just dig into some of the statistics with Richard and Chris, I thought I'd just take you through a little bit about the mechanics of the survey, how it was done, some of the demographics, just so you can see how it compares this year to last year. Importantly, the full survey report, both the executive summary and the full technical report, which most of you, I believe, have on your seats, is available on the internet. Including the continuation of the hosting of an analytical kind of raw data analysis platform, which will allow you to cut by industry, by geography, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot more online for you to explore there. For those of you who haven't got a report or would like an additional copy, there are more copies here on the government stand, so more than welcome to go along and get those. For those of you who are press, there are more available in the press room. So, just about the survey. First thing is always important to look at the demographic of the survey for this year, which we see as being broadly in line with prior years. So we've had no major fluctuations in the size of the organisations that are responding, and also the sectors that are responding to the survey. So broadly speaking, the demographic split is representative year on year, which allows us the facility for trending. This year, we've had 664 responses for the survey. And one of the things that we've done to enhance the quality of this year's results, if you like, is as the survey went out over November last year through to about February, the sessions for people answering the survey were anonymous and sticky, which meant that they could return to their area of the survey and continue with the questions. And certainly, as they came back to the second section of the survey, it counted them as one full response, as opposed to potentially any duplications. I'd also like to thank the organisations that we work with. We couldn't do this on our own. These organisations work very, very closely with us throughout the year and provide us access, along with government, to approximately 64,000 organisations who are invited to take part in the survey itself. The survey is, as it always has been, a self-select survey, and therefore that consideration should come into your perspective on the results that we're presenting. Just in terms of the report this year, a slightly different look and feel from prior years. The important thing to note is at the back of the survey, full technical report, is all of the graphs that you will have seen in all the prior year reports. So if anybody would like to investigate and dig into anything that we're not presenting here or that's not contained in analysis at the front, it's there. And one of the big pieces of feedback we've had from organisations is how critical those graphs are for use in business cases and presentations throughout the year. So all of the information is still in the report and available to anyone who wants a copy. Okay, so I feel like I'm standing between you and a lunch. I'm now going to hand over to Richard to take you through some of the really interesting stories about breaches in the survey.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm just going to give some of the headlines, some of which you've heard already from Giles, but just focus on the key messages that we see coming out from the survey. So the first one is number of breaches and the impact of them, and then get into a couple of the key messages around causes, and then a couple of the key takeaways around impacts as well. And then Chris is going to talk about trends, and Andrew will get into some more detail. So in terms of the number of breaches, the one thing we're seeing this year is a stark continuation from last year. A breach is pretty much inevitable for any organisation. in the UK in today's world. And that's something that we see reflected in clients in all sectors we work with. It's something that I'm sure you see in your organizations, and dealing with breaches is now a fact of life. So for large organizations, 90% had a security breach in the last year. Small, it's up significantly from last year, up to 74%. The median number, so the average number of breaches, is pretty much the same, down slightly from last year in each sector, in each segment, which kind of suggests a continuation of what we saw last year, which is that companies are getting better at dealing with the noise, and sort of the total number of breaches is dropping slightly for each organization. But when they do get a breach, they're more targeted, they're higher impact, as you'll see on the next slide. So it's kind of a continuation of breaches coming more from targeted attacks and less from the noise that's out there, which would probably reflect the take-up of cyber essentials and companies getting better at getting the basics in place and dealing with that noise. Interestingly, a majority expect more breaches next year. So in terms of the impact, as Giles said, more than doubling from last year, and this is looking at the worst breach. So I guess one thing to be clear for those who are unfamiliar with the survey over the years, it kind of talks about two different things. One is the total number of breaches you've experienced, and one is the worst breach you've experienced. So when we talk about the headline figures on impact, we look at the worst breach, which is probably the best indicator of trends. So you can see it's kind of more than doubled from a year ago. And one thing we're seeing more and more across the economy is that people are beginning to realize cybersecurity is less about fixing technology and more actually about fixing the way we use technology. And so we're seeing a gradual increase after breaches of companies and organizations realizing they need to change the way they work, need to change the way they use technology a bit. And this is reflected in the survey, just gradually creeping up, that after the worst breach, organizations are realizing they need to change the way they work, possibly. So then a couple on causes, outsider and insider. So we've seen a large number of organizations have breaches due to unauthorized outsiders. Interestingly, again, sort of getting to the slight reduction in the noise topic, denial of service attacks dropping slightly from last year. And again, that sort of just suggests that we're getting better at dealing with the noise, and it's the big targeted attacks that are getting through. And then the human factor. This is something that Giles picked up on, and this sort of stark headline there. Half of the worst breaches had some element of human error involved. Now that could be clicking on a link in an email, a spear phishing email. It could be opening a document that shouldn't have been opened, that allowed an attacker to take control of a computer on a network. Or it could have been simple things like typing in an email address that you're sending data out to someone and the email address gets auto-completed to the wrong email address. So instead of richard.horn@uk.pwc.com, it goes to richard.horn@gmail.com, and that's not me. So inadvertent human error is creeping in all the way. So either attackers targeting humans or humans committing that error accidentally themselves. And then couple on causes. Probably one of the biggest increases from last year is the reputation element. So you can see up from 30% last year to nearly half this year, their worst single incident was defined by them as by the reputational impact. And you can see down there the bottom statistic. It's very interesting that a large number of incidents are still being kept in-house, not knowledge of them is not leaking out, which kind of illustrates the value of this survey, because this survey is anonymous. Companies can be confident in telling us about their worst breaches in a way that they wouldn't in any other format. So it illustrates the value of this survey, but also illustrates that a lot of what we see in the press is in some ways just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on than we know about. And then finally, just to unpick that headline figure on the cost of the worst breach, this is in the executive summary, or in the detailed report, I think. So you can sort of examine this more at your leisure, but it just illustrates the first line there. The business disruption angle is very much what's driving a lot of the cost, the actual sort of financial cost to businesses. And it gets to what we're going to talk about later, that a key element in defending from cyber attacks is your ability to detect incidents quickly and deal with them quickly. So with that, the headlines, I'm going to hand over to Chris, who has lived this survey since its birth. In fact, I think he gave birth to it. And Chris is recovering from bronchitis, so he has two missions today. One is to stay standing for the entire time, and two is not to cough too much, and three is not let the drugs disrupt what he's saying. So, Chris.
Thank you very much. So, what I'd like to do is, I've been involved in the survey for 15 odd years, and what I'd like to do is just take you through a little bit of the trend analysis over that period. One of the great things about this survey is it is the longest running survey into information security breaches in the world, and it really does give a good feel for how things have changed over a period of time. And one of the most dramatic things is if you look at the cost of people's worst security breach of the year, that has gone up dramatically over the last decade. So it's gone up over tenfold over that period. The other thing that you'll notice from this chart is there's a very strong correlation between the cost to large organizations of their worst breach and the cost to small organizations. So breaches are actually hitting organizations in a similar way, or the impact of breaches is hitting organizations. Clearly, large organizations, it costs much more, but typically it's about 10 times the amount that it costs small organizations for their worst breach of the year. And what's contributing those worst breaches? So there are three major types of incidents that continue to be the main causes of the worst breaches. And those have gone up and down over the years, but remain the key areas. If you go back to 2004, 2006, the story was largely about malicious software. It was largely about malware. And we're seeing that continuing, but largely being used as a vehicle to enable subsequent remote access by outsiders into people's data these days. But the two other areas have really grown over the last 5 or 6 years. And those have been direct attacks by unauthorized outsiders, so whether those are hackers, hacktivists, whatever, and also the loss or leakage of confidential data. And of those, the loss or leakage of confidential data is the one which is rising most. And that picks up what Richard was saying earlier, that roughly 50% of the worst breaches have been caused by inadvertent human error. So let's just have a look at a couple of those in a little bit more detail. This chart shows the number of organizations, or the percentage of organizations, that responded that they knew that an unauthorized outsider had successfully penetrated into their systems during the year. So they had been hacked. And here we're seeing, thankfully, a slight drop in the large organizations who noted that they've been penetrated, but it's still running at about 1 in 5 of large organizations know that hackers have successfully broken into their organization over the last year. Still quite a scary figure, and if you talk to the hacking community, they will say for every organization that knows about it, that detects it, there are many who do not still. Whether you believe that is up to you. And then the second area that I highlighted where we're seeing a real growth is in the organizations that have lost confidential data or IP. And here we're seeing an increase, continual increase in the number of large organizations that have lost confidential data over the course of a year. That's now up to about 2/3 of large organizations have lost confidential data in the last year. And we're also seeing about a fifth of small businesses report that they've lost confidential data as well. So those really are the main trends over time to look out for. It'd be very interesting to see how that continues over future years. So I'll now hand back to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think you can declare that a success. Okay, so understanding and communicating the risks. I think it's fair to say, throughout all the kind of headlines we've heard so far, the human element is becoming absolutely critical. Whether it's a technological approach or whether it's something that's directly aimed at the staff and users, the human element is becoming the linchpin in both kind of vectors of attack and causing or contributing significantly to the breaches. So we ask organizations, respondents, what contributes to your worst breach? We break it down. So we ask them about the different types of human failing that could be involved. And on the left-hand side here, you can see 4 contributing factors to an organization's worst breach. Now, okay, we put that to one side there. It is very heartwarming, however, to see that organizations are increasing their briefing and education programs to their users and staff. I think recognizing that the staff and the kind of human element is that key piece. Getting that message out there is critically important. I mean, some of the other statistics that we have show that if you have a security policy, and most organizations have a security policy, and the figures for having a security policy are roughly stagnant over the last few years. If you educate and make your staff aware, you reduce the likelihood of breach by 30%. So making your staff aware of the policy you have and educating them in it, how to use it, how it applies to their daily job, integrating that policy into the culture and operation of the organization is fundamentally important and contributes to the most significant reduction in the likelihood of breach. What is unfortunate to see, however, is that 1 in 10 organizations have no formal security awareness education program at all, which is something hopefully we'll be able to push down even further and possibly even stamp out. Should make it socially unacceptable not to have a user and training awareness program. All of this needs to come from the top, however. Staff follow the culture and approach, the management influence. So they need to see that there is that reinforcing, the reward, the well-dones, the pat on the backs, the instructions, the backing, the buy-in. All of that needs to come down from the senior management teams. Now, there is a perennial bit of a challenge from the security industry. There's a bit of a chicken egg here. The first one is you have to tell the management exactly what the situation is. You have to do your risk assessments. You have to brief them. You have to tell them what's happening in the organization, the risk choices that they're making through their decisions in business. And we're not quite there yet. You can see on the left-hand side, we're not quite telling them enough the situation that they face and the choices that they are making. And we can interestingly see the other side of that, which is the respondents when asked, contributing factors to your breaches, your worst breach. Insufficient priority by management was cited by 28% of respondents to being a contributing factor to the worst breach. So interesting, there's a kind of, we're not quite telling them the full story enough. Maybe they don't want to listen, but we're not quite telling them. And at the same time, they're not quite giving that priority, so we feel that we're not getting the support that we want. So I think, again, there's a bit of a bridge to be built there, and part of that is sticking with that communication, making them aware of those risks, and helping to drive that communication. And I think we, as an industry, might need to continue to keep offering that olive branch out there. So, standards and guidance. We've seen the Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus schemes come out. And we know we've got ISO 27001. So if we just look at the statistics around those, ISO 27001 is perennially a good performer. It's well established in the market. People are aware of it. Organizations that have adopted it or aware of it, partially adopted it, or will be adopting it in the future For large organizations, 81%. We're seeing that it's being asked in supply chains on a regular basis. Respondents are saying they're putting it out there, they're asking their supply chain to do it. So there's a natural kind of business pull to be ISO 27001 certified or compliant in a variety of different ways. It also provides a good basis for implementing management systems and for organizations. On the flip side, what we've seen with the Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus schemes is they're quite accessible, and the 10 steps as well. So where organizations have not necessarily been able to access, understand, integrate with the ISO standard, they've been able to access, integrate, and find empathy with the Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus schemes, which I think has been fundamentally important to the increase in activity that we've seen, certainly amongst the smaller organizations. So the main driver for information security, what's the motivation? Is it the loss of cash? Is it the loss of IPR, loss of reputation, etc.? The leading motivational drivers, what we're seeing from respondents, are coming around protecting an organization's reputation. That's reputation in the market, reputation with their business partners, and most importantly, you can see here on the center, protecting customer information. So anyone who's got any interaction with the public, that brand value, that share of the voice, that's critically important, something that they're really keen to protect. More so than potentially just using cash or even losing IPR, which could potentially threaten market position. So that's quite an interesting one. A third of organizations, I mean, you can look at this 33% in terms of making no change in their cybersecurity investment, the way they do it, the amount they invest. You would hope that they would be pretty confident in the information security management approach that they've deployed in order to have a breach, and then just decide that actually, if it's their worst single breach, just continue the way they are. So hopefully that the post-incident analysis would steer them to making decisions to protect against that in the future. One of the key messages and themes coming out of last year was measuring the return on investment of information and cybersecurity spend. So the good news is more organizations are measuring the return on investment of their information and cybersecurity spend. In order for information security expenditure, budget, management to increase in terms of its reputation and maturity, it needs to prove to management and executive that the risk decisions they're taking, the controls implementations, etc., the changes in business are actually materially providing a benefit to the organization the way it trades. So seeing this trend go up, I think is fantastic, and integrating that into management packs for executive boards will help show that security is becoming a contributor in the effective running of an organization, rather than just being the sale of controls on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. For roughly half of respondents, the implementation of controls ultimately comes down to regulatory compliance by one means or another, whether that be in supply chain, a regulator, etc. So it's good to see that the ROI is being, by volume, more respondents, but ultimately there is that mainstay of roughly half will do it because they need to be compliant and regulated. So what's the story on budget? You know, the breaches surveys always tracked the percentage information and cybersecurity budget as a percentage of IT. This is the first time we've pulled this graph together because we wanted to see what was happening in all the different industries. I know it's a bit busy, but each one of these lines represents one of the individual markets that the respondents come from. And as you can see, early in sort of 2008 to 2012, they're reasonably well bunched. I think that was because the market was still kind of getting to the point of understanding the security risks as applicable to them, maturing in different speeds. And what you can see post-2012 is different markets accelerating and understanding their risks at different paces. And you can see that they're taking a much more proportionate approach, especially in light of the recent economy, to spend what they think they need to control the risks that they have. So ultimately becoming more divergent, and what I anticipate to see is those becoming more uniform as time goes on, as they separate out into essentially the control cost environments that they have. So, key factors implementation. Over to Richard.
Thank you, Andrew. So just 4 closing kind of messages, and then we'll move into Q&A. So when it comes to implementing cybersecurity, there are kind of 4 key things that we've been tracking for the last few years and starting to tell an interesting story. One is the speed to detect incidents. Second is completely gone. Then the dependency on outsourced or IT that's outside of your control, whether that's mobile or whether that's cloud. And then the final one is cyber insurance, which is something which has been talked about a lot, and some interesting messages coming from the survey there. So on the identifying incidents side, an interesting thing, if you go back to where we started, breaches pretty much inevitable. So a key part of your security defense is your ability to detect breaches when they happen and respond quickly. And you can see here that there's still a lot of work to do. And interestingly, a kind of quite a big reduction from in the incidents that were spotted within a day from last year. And a new category we put this year was sort of the outlying more than 100 days, and quite a large number of incidents there. So when you go back to the cost of incidents, a large part of that being the business disruption and the length of the incident, then this is a key metric for companies to be watching themselves and to be watching across the economy. The second element, cyber insurance. If you take the survey at face value, it appears that the market has dropped, which I don't think is the case. I think in the UK, the cybersecurity market is still quite immature. It's more mature in the US. And what I think we're seeing, and certainly from when we've gone through this with our review panel and the insurance organizations there, it would appear that companies are getting better at understanding how their kind of normal business disruption kind of insurance may not cover cyber breaches. And so there's kind of actually quite a big reduction in the percentage of respondents who believe they have insurance that covers them. But interestingly, again, a sign of the immaturity of the market, with no mandatory breach reporting in the UK, whereas there is in the US, certainly for consumer data loss, then sort of the market's probably less driven in the UK than it is in the US in terms of organizations expecting to buy cyber insurance in the future. Then the 2 elements of this sort of interconnected world in which we live, one, mobile devices, a stark growth from last year in terms of the percentage of breaches that were caused by some kind of mobile device. And interestingly, organizations still need to do some work to sort of get their minds and their arms around the challenge associated with especially bring your own device. And then the last element, we're seeing a large increase in cloud. So this is a jump over 2 years from 21% to 30% of respondents now using cloud storage. And so a large number of kind of contractual type controls put in place for cloud storage. But at the end of the day, with mobile devices, with cloud, the key challenge for organizations in today's world is you don't control the systems that you're relying on for your data security. And so what we're seeing more and more is organizations looking to work out how they can control the security of their data, even if they might have lost control of the systems that they rely on to process that data. So to close, to go back to the kind of the main headlines, and then we'll take a few questions. Breaches, pretty much inevitable. The cost of the worst breach is growing starkly year on year. We're seeing companies better at dealing with the noise, and interesting tie-in with the increasing take-up on cyber essentials there. We're seeing human factor as a key element, growing element in breaches, and we're seeing reputation growing quite significantly year on year in terms of sort of defining that worst breach, the impact on organizations' reputation. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been interesting for you hearing us talk through. We've got a wealth of information in the packs on your chairs. Apologies to the cheap seats at the back who don't have the packs, but you can get them from the government stall, and everything's available on the websites. So with that, I think we'll open up for questions. So we're all here. Does anyone have a question?
The 3 worst types of breach did not include financial breach. Was it that they hardly ever occurred, or companies didn't report them?
Do you want to pick up on
that? Yes. Generally speaking, financial breaches, so theft of money, is relatively rare. When it does occur, it tends to be one of the disproportionately bad things. So it tends to be more often people's worst breach of the year, but it's a much lower frequency than the other three that were up there amongst the worst breaches of the year. And that's a trend which we've seen throughout the last decade.
Okay, any other questions? You want to shut down?
Hi. You mentioned that formal evaluation of the effectiveness of cyber security control is increasing. How are you formally evaluating the effectiveness and the return on investment on these controls?
So, do you want to pick that up, Andrew?
Yeah. So we ask organisations whether they actually measure the return on investment and do they have other mechanisms to report back to management in terms of the value. We don't ask them exactly how they do it. So it's up to them in terms of exactly how they report that, how they measure it, and how they communicate that. The point is they're actually doing some kind of evaluation.
So I guess the important thing is this is a survey where it's up to the respondents to answer. Is this is an investigation? Over there.
Oh, hello. Could I ask some more questions about the Open University free training that you mentioned? Do we have a URL for that?
So Giles at the end.
Yeah, so if you go on to gov.uk and look for the Mooc, the Massive Open Online Course, Cybersecurity course, you'll be able to find it there. Mooc, Massive Open Online Course, Cybersecurity. It's on the Future Learn learning portal. Future Learn will also be able to signpost you to it. It's free to anyone to use. It's 8 weeks chunks of tuition, and as I say, 55,000 registrations already, and highly recommend it.
Fantastic, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, there's one down here at the front.
So this is a UK-based survey, is that right? Yes. Do you have any information that would make this relative to the rest of Europe, globally, anything, something like that? So just to put it into perspective with how the UK is doing in comparison with the rest of this. So this is a InfoSec Europe, so obviously people might be visiting from outside of the UK, so just to put it into perspective, thanks.
So this is a survey commissioned by the UK government, so it's a UK-based survey. There are other surveys out there that give kind of similar kind of perspectives where you can make global comparisons. So in PwC, we do a survey globally called the Global State of Information Security, which gives you that sort of global comparison. But this survey is focused on the UK only, as it's commissioned by the UK government.
Just further to that.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I'd like to just ask you to expand on that a little bit. You know, as you said, you do research across the globe. What are the key areas where there's a big difference in the results you're seeing here in the UK versus what's happening elsewhere in the world?
That's a big question. So I think we're seeing differences. So probably the biggest difference is the US versus kind of, you almost see when we go back to, I think we did our last global survey back in October, you kind of see the US suffering much more breaches, much more visibility of the breaches because of the regulatory environment there, whether it's reporting, potentially more maturity there. You see the level of spend still increasing in the UK. In the US, it's probably leveling off a bit. Interestingly, what came out from the survey back in October was in the UK, the boards, sort of senior management and the board seem to be more aware than in the US and sort of setting a more proactive tone, which is good. And then typically you see kind of Europe and other parts of the world a bit slower in terms of the rise of incidents and the scale of them. But it's pretty hard to, in 2 seconds draw sweeping conclusions, but we can get you more material on that if you'd be interested.
One of the key differences which I see is around the regulatory breaches reporting environment, and of course in Europe that's due to change to an environment which is more akin to what we're seeing in the US. So if you look at the moment in the results of this survey, you'll see that most organisations have been able to keep their worst breach confidential and not had external media coverage of it. But that media coverage, where it has happened, has caused a disproportionate impact on the organisations. So it's one of the key challenges, I think, for UK and European organisations as reporting of breaches becomes more public, how they then respond to that.
Sorry, just to pick up, coming back to your question, return on investment. So page 36, figure 15, we do actually ask organisations exactly how they do it. So to give you a bit of a rundown here, measuring the trend in information security incidents and costs, benchmarking against other organisations, particular ROI calculations, measuring staff awareness, monitoring regulatory compliance, feedback from management, do not formally evaluate, and then active technical testing, penetration testing, and tabletop exercises. So there's a nice split, if you like, by all the different techniques that contribute to that response. Sorry.
And on that, the leading organisations carry out a bit of a balanced scorecard of several different metrics rather than relying on any single metric.
Yeah.
Okay, I think time for one last question.
Yep, absolutely.
Gentleman, towards the back.
We'll come back afterwards.
Hello. You mentioned a large increase in targeting. To what extent is personal targeting, social engineering? I mean, people are giving away. You also have a large category of insider breaches and whatever. I mean, how much of that is opening targeted emails specifically from socially engineered environments where they're giving away their privacy details and whatever? Is that taken into account in the personal breaches or the targeted attacks?
So one thing, a slight differentiation to draw is this survey is focused on organisations and breaches to those organisations. So a lot of those breaches, a growing amount of those is due to targeted emails targeting an employee or someone on the inside of that organisation. But then there's a parallel world which this survey hasn't covered, which is the kind of the consumer market and how consumers are being targeted by criminals and the like with personal information, and that's something which this survey doesn't cover in particular. Does that make sense? Oh. Sorry, hang on, we get a microphone.
Most employees are consumers. I mean,
yeah. So
they're also citizens of government as well. I mean, there's a huge amount of personal information being given away, and if the BYOD factor isn't working.
Absolutely. So where an organisation has been targeted because of through an individual in that organisation, and you can break down some of the statistics on page 40, kind of give you that, where it's an employee or a individual inside that organisation, because they are inside that organisation is targeted, then that's absolutely covered here. So whether it's their own device or whatever. Good. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope that's been useful for you. And please do move on to your next talk.